Chapter 1. An Invitation to Adventure. It was a crisp autumn morning when the letter arrived. Tony Middleton, a tall young man with an unruly mop of hair and an even more unruly personality, held it in his hands, squinting at the seal that was embossed with a grand coat of arms. Another one of her peculiar invitations, he muttered, already feeling the familiar mixture of dread and curiosity welling up inside him. He turned it over to reveal the flowery handwriting of his great-aunt, Lady Winifred, a woman renowned both for her eccentricities and her undying love for antiquities, especially ones that seemed to have no logical explanation for existing. "What does it say?" asked Sally Cartwright, his best friend and partner in many misadventures. Sally, with her sharp eyes and quicker wit, leaned over his shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of the letter. Tony cleared his throat, reading aloud with an exaggerated flourish. "Dearest nephew Tony and esteemed friend Miss Cartwright," he began in an overly formal tone. "It has come to my attention that you both possess the curiosity and verve for a little adventure. You are cordially invited to join me this weekend at Foxleigh Manor for the unveiling of a most spectacular treasure, the Stagecoach Heirloom, which, as you know, is said to be one of the oldest and most valuable possessions in my collection. Come, enjoy good food, drink, and an array of fascinating individuals. I look forward to your company. Yours faithfully, Lady Winifred." Sally raised an eyebrow. "Spectacular treasure? An heirloom tied to royalty, no less? How perfectly, bizarre?" Tony finished for her, knowing exactly what she was thinking. "I wouldn't be surprised if half the treasure was made up of taxidermied animals and dusty furniture, but it could be interesting, I suppose. When is it?" Sally snatched the letter from his hands, scanning it. "This weekend, the very same weekend we were supposed to finish our paper on ancient Roman architecture." "Priority, Sally, priorities." Tony flashed a grin, nudging her. "Besides, who needs the stress of ancient Rome when we can have a weekend of eccentric relatives and priceless trinkets?" Sally hesitated, but her eyes twinkled with the promise of an adventure, as always. True. And what harm could a weekend at a mysterious manor with a strange artifact possibly do? Besides, we may find a good mystery to solve. Or, more likely, get ourselves into all sorts of trouble. Tony's grin widened. Trouble is what we do best. Foxleigh Manor was located an hour's train ride from London, nestled on the outskirts of a small village surrounded by rolling hills and dense woodlands. As the two friends arrived at the manor's towering gates, the house loomed ahead like something out of a Gothic novel, a sprawling structure of ivy-clad stone and weather-beaten windows. The moment they entered the front hall, they were greeted by a flurry of activity. A pair of butlers, both stiff and perfectly coordinated, ushered them into a vast drawing room where a number of other guests were already assembling. The room was filled with the scent of lavender and the sound of clinking glasses, as a host of people in their best evening attire mingled near a roaring fire. "Tony, I think I just saw someone wearing a monocle," Sally whispered, wide-eyed, nudging her friend. "This place is already off to a brilliant start." "I think I just spotted a man with a bow tie on a walking stick," Tony whispered back, equally amused. "He's probably a very important lord, but he certainly looks like he's in need of a good tailor." They both burst into silent laughter, quickly stifling it when a sharp voice rang out from across the room. "Tony! Sally! Over here!" It was Lady Winifred, standing near a large portrait of herself, which was positioned at the center of the room. She looked every bit the eccentric aristocrat Tony remembered, her hair piled in a mound of curls on top of her head, a flamboyant feathered hat perched precariously to one side. She wore a dress that had seen better decades, and in her hand she clutched a glass of wine that appeared to have been poured with all the care of a scientist handling a delicate specimen. "Ah, my dears, how wonderful to see you both!" She beamed, her sharp, beady eyes glinting as she looked them up and down. "Tony, you look as tall and gangly as ever, And Miss Cartwright, my word, you've grown even more delightfully compact. Come, sit. She waved her hand extravagantly towards the two empty chairs beside her. As Tony and Sally sat down, they exchanged a glance that said everything about how they felt about Lady Winifred's style of greeting. The woman was nothing if not unique. So, Lady Winifred began, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, I'm certain you've heard the legends of the Stagecoach Heirloom, haven't you? Of course, Tony said, trying to sound impressed. Quite the treasure, I'm sure. Lady Winifred's face lit up. Indeed, the heirloom has been passed down through generations. Some say it has royal ties, others claim it has the power to grant wishes. But we shan't get into that now. I've planned an entire evening of revelry to celebrate its unveiling. She raised her glass in a mock toast, accidentally spilling a small amount of wine onto her own lap. Sally stifled a laugh. How delightful, she said with a straight face, her eyes sparkling with barely contained mirth. I'm sure this will be an event to remember. Lady Winifred didn't seem to notice their amusement. Oh, I almost forgot. Let me show you my collection of portraits, she continued, suddenly leaping to her feet and practically dragging them toward a nearby hallway. I've had them done by the best artists, each one capturing the essence of the person, of course, though some have had, shall we say, more success than others. As they entered the hall of portraits, Sally froze mid-step. Before them were several large, rather somber paintings of Lady Winifred's relatives. She stared at the nearest one, a stern-looking man in a military uniform. Lady Winifred's eyes narrowed as she whipped around. That was my dear Uncle Reginald, Miss Cartwright. He was simply a very serious man, that's all. Lady Winifred snapped, her lips pressing into a thin line. There was a brief, awkward pause before she added, But no matter. You must simply meet the others. More guests are arriving, and the unveiling is soon. Exciting times ahead. As Lady Winifred hustled away, Sally turned to Tony, eyes wide. I think I've just made a rather unfortunate impression. Tony grinned, nudging her. No worse than my accidental breaking of that vase earlier. We're both off to a splendid start. Indeed, she sighed. At least we can't get into any more trouble than this. Can we? But as the night continued, Tony and Sally would soon discover that trouble was never far behind when adventure called. Chapter 2. A Glittering Gathering. The evening began with all the elegance and chaos one would expect from a gathering at Foxleigh Manor. Tony and Sally, now fully dressed in their finest clothes, though Tony's tie remained stubbornly askew, entered the grand drawing room. The vast chamber, with its gleaming chandeliers and towering portraits, was alive with chatter and the clink of crystal glasses. The warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth contrasted with the cold formality of the guests who milled about, speaking in hushed tones and exchanging polite pleasantries. You know, Sally whispered to Tony as they took in the scene, I think this might be the first time I've ever felt underdressed. And I'm wearing a full-length gown. Tony, ever the skeptic, gave her a sideways glance. Speak for yourself. I feel like an imposter in a room full of very, very well-dressed criminals. As they navigated their way through the room, eyes darting from one guest to another, they quickly became aware of the colorful cast of suspects that Lady Winifred had gathered. The first to catch their attention was Sir Horace Tibbles, a man who seemed to exude charm in waves. He stood in the corner, laughing heartily with two women draped in diamonds. A gambler by trade, Sir Horace had a reputation for being perpetually on the brink of financial ruin, yet his easy smile and silver tongue never failed to win the favor of those around him. Tony, Sally muttered under her breath. I can almost hear him already. A lady's love is worth more than a fortune, unless, of course, the fortune is available for a quick game of cards. Tony chuckled. I'm sure you're spot on, but look, He's pocketing something. Sally's eyes narrowed as Sir Horace casually slipped a silver spoon into the pocket of his coat. That's odd, she said, sounding amused. I can't think of a single reason why a gentleman would pocket a spoon at a social gathering. Tony smirked. Perhaps he's trying to start a new trend. Who wouldn't want a collection of silverware in their pockets? The momentary distraction was broken by a loud clatter. Miss Penelope Fairfax, a young woman with fiery red hair and an even fiercer temper, had stormed out of the drawing room in a flurry of anger. Her hands were clutching a set of brushes, and her face was flushed with indignation. "What on earth happened there?" Sally asked. Judging by the way she was storming off, I'd say Lady Winifred didn't appreciate her artistic critique, Tony remarked, watching the artist retreat down the hall. She's the one who had that falling out with Aunt Winifred over a portrait, wasn't she? Sally nodded. Yes, the one where Miss Fairfax painted her as, well, a slightly younger version of a badger. I can only imagine how that went over. Before they could speculate further, they were distracted by a sharp, almost eerie voice. "Ah, Tony, Miss Cartwright, so glad you could join us." Dr. Edwin Hawthorne, the reclusive historian and one of Lady Winifred's closest confidants, appeared from the shadows. His gaunt frame and unsettlingly pale face gave him the appearance of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in a decade. He was clutching a glass of wine as if it were an ancient relic, his eyes fixed on the heirloom displayed on a pedestal in the center of the room. "Dr. Hawthorne," Tony said, trying to hide the discomfort he always felt around the man. "I assume you're here to do more than just admire the Stagecoach?" The historian's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "Ah, the Stagecoach heirloom," he sighed dramatically. "There's so much more to it than meets the eye, my dear boy. So much history, so many secrets. It's a key to understanding this country's true heritage." Sally raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure Lady Winifred is quite pleased to have someone who speaks so fondly of her collection." Dr. Hawthorne barely acknowledged her comment, lost in his thoughts about the heirloom. He turned abruptly, walking off in the direction of the library, muttering to himself. "That man is as strange as an old book that refuses to be opened," Tony muttered, shaking his head. "I swear he's obsessed with the history of that artifact to the point of madness." "I'm sure he's harmless," Sally replied, though there was a hint of doubt in her voice. "But we should keep an eye on him." Just then, Mrs. Clara Booth, Lady Winifred's longtime housekeeper, entered the room. Her stern face was hidden behind a cascade of graying curls, but her eyes were sharp as ever. She walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew all the estate's secrets, and there were many, judging by the way she glanced around the room with the air of someone who was not easily impressed. "There she is," Tony whispered, "the ever-watchful Mrs. Booth." Sally watched the housekeeper carefully. There's something about her, though. She's far too calm. I wouldn't be surprised if she knows more about this heirloom than anyone else. "Then she's certainly someone we should keep an eye on," Tony muttered. But before they could discuss further, an awkward interruption occurred. Tony, feeling increasingly uncomfortable in the glittering, formal atmosphere, had taken it upon himself to pour himself a drink. He was reaching for a decanter of port when he accidentally knocked over a candlestick. As he lunged to steady it, he tipped over the entire candle, sending a small flame dangerously close to the curtains. "Tony!" Sally shouted, grabbing his sleeve and pulling him back. "Are you trying to set the entire room on fire?" "Not at all," Tony said, flustered, his face turning beet red. "I was simply ensuring the candles were, well, adequately lit. A little too adequately, apparently." "I swear, you could cause a firestorm just by walking into a room," Sally muttered, while frantically dousing the flame with a nearby cloth. As she patted the curtain down, she whispered, "You'll have to explain this to Aunt Winifred later, unless we make a quick getaway before she notices." Tony groaned. "She'll probably just add the fire hazard to the list of oddities about me." But I'll tell you one thing. I'm not sure I can stand another minute of this high society nonsense. Don't worry, Sally replied with a grin. We're here for the mystery, remember? Let's find out who's actually worth keeping an eye on in this crowd. As the evening wore on, Tony and Sally continued to observe the strange behavior of the guests, eavesdropping on whispered conversations and noting the subtle tensions between the suspects. Sir Horace's pockets seemed perpetually full of odd trinkets. Miss Penelope's sharp tongue only grew more frayed as the evening wore on. Dr. Hawthorne disappeared into every room that seemed to hold a secret, and Mrs. Booth, ever watchful, kept her distance, but always seemed to be in the room when someone needed to be watched. Chapter 3. A Night of Shadows. Dinner at Foxleigh Manor was a lavish affair, as one might expect for an event centered around the unveiling of such a significant artifact. The long oak table gleamed under the soft light of chandeliers, with crystal goblets and gleaming silverware arranged with meticulous precision. The guests, their faces illuminated by the golden glow, were already well into their third course, each one playing their part in the high society performance. Lady Winifred, at the head of the table, beamed proudly at the assembled guests. She was in her element, commanding attention and regaling her audience with tales of the Heirloom's supposed royal connections. Sally leaned over to Tony, trying to tune out Lady Winifred's voice as it rose dramatically. "Do you think she actually believes all this?" Sally whispered, casting a sideways glance at the elderly matriarch. Tony, trying to navigate his own plate of soup without spilling it, replied, "I don't think anyone here believes it, but I'm sure they'll all pretend to. It's more fun that way." "Well, I'm certainly not convinced," Sally replied, her eyes flicking toward the Stagecoach heirloom, now displayed on a pedestal in the center of the dining room. The gleaming brass and silver artifact seemed almost too perfect, its history as polished as its surface. It caught the light in a way that made it appear almost sinister. But perhaps that was just Sally's overactive imagination at work. At that moment, Lady Winifred raised her glass, her voice ringing out above the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I present to you the crown jewel of my collection, our very own Stagecoach heirloom," she declared, as if announcing the arrival of royalty. The room fell into a hushed silence. The guests, their conversations momentarily halted, turned their attention to the gleaming artifact. There was a collective gasp of admiration as the object caught the light once again, casting a shimmering glow across the room. For a brief moment, it was as if the heirloom was the only thing that mattered, and the guests were merely onlookers in its presence. But beneath the surface, there was something else. Tony caught sight of Sir Horace, his eyes glinting with something more than appreciation, perhaps greed, as he stared at the heirloom. Across the table, Miss Penelope's lips were pursed tightly, her sharp eyes darting between Lady Winifred and the artifact. She wasn't admiring it, no. She was eyeing it with suspicion. Dr. Hawthorne, as always, looked as though he were about to faint in awe, but there was something unsettling in the way he stroked his chin as if making mental notes on the heirloom's every detail. And then there was Mrs. Booth, standing by the door, her arms crossed, watching the whole scene unfold with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen it all before. Sally leaned toward Tony. "What do you make of all this? Doesn't it feel off?" "I'm starting to think it's not just the food that's giving me indigestion," Tony whispered back, glancing around the room. "I don't trust any of these people. It's like they're all waiting for something to happen, and it won't be good." Just as he finished speaking, there was a sudden flicker of the lights. A murmur rippled through the guests. The chandeliers dimmed, and the warmth of the room seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sudden chill. The next thing they knew, the lights went out completely. The manor plunged into darkness. At first there was stunned silence. Tony's hand instinctively shot out, knocking his wine glass off the table with a loud clink. "Is anyone else seeing this?" Tony muttered, As a nervous laugh broke from someone across the table, it was followed by an uncomfortable shuffle of chairs. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, until suddenly, a scream, sharp and blood-curdling, echoed through the hall. It was a woman's scream, full of terror, followed by hurried footsteps as the panic set in. "Help! Help!" The voice, unmistakably Miss Penelope's, rang out. "The heirloom! It's gone! It's gone!" The scream cut off as quickly as it had begun. For a few moments, no one moved. Then, the lights flickered back to life. In the brief span of time when the darkness had descended, something had changed. The Stagecoach heirloom, which had been so magnificently displayed moments before, was now missing. It was no longer on its pedestal. "Where is it?" Sally said, as her eyes scanned the now brightly lit room. The guests looked just as bewildered, but none more so than Lady Winifred, whose pale face contorted in shock. My heirloom!" Lady Winifred's voice trembled. She rushed to the pedestal, her hands hovering over the empty space where the artifact had been just minutes ago. Her voice dropped to a low, frantic whisper. How could this happen? Tony's mind raced. He was the first to move, stepping forward. "Everyone stay calm. We need to figure out what happened." He turned to Sally, his eyes narrowing. "We'll have to ask questions, look for clues." Sally nodded, already scanning the room with a sharp gaze, then whispered to Tony, "We should start with the suspects." "What about Penelope? She screamed. She must know something." Tony whispered back. They turned to where Miss Penelope had been seated, but the artist was nowhere to be found. Her chair was empty, and her belongings, a brush and a small notebook, were still resting on the table. Tony cursed under his breath, then straightened. "Right, we'll start there. Come on, Sally." As they moved to investigate further, Tony couldn't help but notice something odd. By the side of the room, perched on a wooden perch, was a brightly colored parrot, pecking lazily at a shiny object. Tony, distracted by the bird, walked over to it. "That's odd," he said, pointing at the parrot. "I'm pretty sure that bird didn't have an heirloom in its beak earlier." Sally glanced over, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Tony bent down, inspecting the bird's beak closely. "Look, it's holding a spoon, a silver spoon. It's the same one Sir Horace slipped into his pocket earlier." Sally blinked, taking a step back. "Are you seriously trying to interrogate a parrot now?" "No," Tony said, his voice exasperated. "But I'm telling you, this bird's involved somehow. We need to talk to it. It's seen something, I'm sure of it." Sally stifled a laugh, shaking her head. "We've got a missing heirloom, a bunch of suspicious guests, and you're trying to talk to a parrot? Right. Well, I'll leave you to that. Meanwhile, I'll check with the others." As Sally went off to question the rest of the guests, Tony continued to stare at the bird, muttering under his breath. "I'll get to the bottom of this, mark my words. And you, my fine feathered friend, are going to help." Chapter 4. Clues in the Conservatory. The manor was in chaos. The sudden disappearance of the heirloom had sent ripples through the gathering, and Lady Winifred was now pacing frantically in her sitting room, wringing her hands in distress. The other guests were equally rattled, murmuring to one another, their faces painted with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "Let's take this one step at a time," Tony said, his voice resolute. "We need to start looking for clues. If we're going to solve this, we have to find out where the heirloom went. And fast." Sally nodded, the wheels of her mind already turning. "Right. First things first. Let's check the places no one else would think to look. The conservatory is quiet, and it's far enough from the main commotion that we might find something no one else has noticed." They made their way through the dark, winding hallways of Foxleigh Manor. The heavy silence that surrounded the manor was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional murmur of a guest in the distance, or the sound of Lady Winifred's voice, now drifting through the halls in a faint, unsteady cry. Reaching the conservatory, Tony pushed open the door. The faint smell of earth and plants greeted them, and the sound of a fountain trickling in the corner added a strange calm to the otherwise tense atmosphere. The room was filled with lush greenery, and a collection of strange, exotic plants decorated every corner. Tony took a deep breath and looked around, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of disturbance. "It's too quiet in here," Sally muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wouldn't be surprised if someone thought to hide something." Tony was about to reply when his foot caught on something. His shoe snagged on a corner of fabric that was caught in the conservatory door. With a swift tug, he freed it and held it up. It was a torn piece of pale blue fabric, frayed at the edges as though it had been ripped hastily from someone's coat or sleeve. "This is strange," he said, inspecting it closely. "It looks like it came from someone's outfit. And it's caught on the door, meaning whoever left it here was probably in a hurry." Sally squinted, narrowing her eyes. "What's more suspicious is that it's torn. Whoever wore this must have been struggling to get through this door, or they were trying to sneak in." Tony nodded. "We'll keep this piece in mind, but let's check the fireplace too. That seems like the kind of place a person might toss something if they wanted to get rid of it in a hurry." They moved toward the fireplace, where the faint smell of burnt paper lingered in the air. The flames had long since died down, but as they peered inside, they spotted something odd. A partially burnt note, blackened at the edges, lay just at the edge of the hearth. Sally reached down and carefully pulled it out. It was crumpled, but still legible enough to make out the words, "Meet me by the kitchen door after midnight. We'll be gone before anyone notices." "That doesn't sound good," Tony said, his voice low. "Someone was planning to make a hasty exit. The kitchen door could be a good place to start." Sally held the note up to the light, her brow furrowing. "Whoever wrote this is trying to cover their tracks. And if they were going to meet someone by the kitchen, then maybe there's more to the story than we thought." Tony glanced at her, a mischievous glint in his eye. "That's a solid lead. But we'll need to check the kitchen next, and try to figure out who might be meeting under the cover of darkness." Without wasting any time, they made their way toward the kitchen, moving as quietly as possible through the shadows of the manor. As they rounded a corner near the back hall, they both froze. "Muddy footprints," Sally whispered, her finger pointing to the ground where clear marks were visible, leading from the kitchen door toward the hallway. "It looks like someone walked right through here." Tony crouched down, inspecting the footprints. "They're fresh," he muttered. "But whoever made them was in quite a hurry." Sally shook her head. No time for cleaning up. Whoever it was wanted to make sure they didn't get caught. They followed the trail of footprints down the hallway, passing several rooms in the dark, and eventually found themselves outside the kitchen door. It creaked loudly as Tony tried to open it. He winced. "This is it, Sally. The kitchen's where they planned to sneak away from." But as Tony reached for the handle to push the door open, he made a critical mistake. He stepped forward too quickly. His foot collided with a metal object, a small tin bucket that had been left on the floor by the door. The bucket toppled over with a loud crash, and its contents of small, heavy cans spilled out. "Oh no," Tony muttered, immediately kicking the bucket aside to stop it from clanging any louder. His eyes darted nervously as he glanced toward the hallway. "Tony, you've done it again," Sally said, eyes wide. "I'm just trying to avoid another fire," he whispered back, feeling embarrassed. Now the whole manor probably knows we're here. At that very moment, to his horror, the kitchen door swung open unexpectedly. It was locked, then it wasn't. A gust of cold air blasted through as the door swung wide. Tony turned quickly, but the result was disastrous. In the process of turning away from the bucket, he had knocked into the pantry door, which had remained slightly ajar. The door groaned on its hinges, and Tony, still off balance, fell right inside. Sally turned, alarmed. "What is it?" Tony was standing in front of the pantry, his hands pressing against the door. I'm locked in. Sally blinked in disbelief. Locked in? Are you serious? Tony rattled the door handle, but it was clear that the lock had been firmly latched on the other side. Apparently so. Must have been one of those silly servant locks. You know, the kind that's supposed to keep people out, unless they happen to wander in and get trapped. Sally stifled a laugh, but quickly shook her head. Hold on, I'll find a way to get you out. She darted down the hall to look for a servant, but the manor seemed eerily empty. No servants to be found. As she passed the drawing room, she spotted Lady Winifred, who was now pacing in a frenzy, muttering to herself. Sally grinned to herself and took a deep breath, preparing herself for a task she had reluctantly accepted: distracting Lady Winifred. Sally cleared her throat and strode up to the woman with a pleasant smile. Lady Winifred, it's an honor to meet such a passionate collector of rare stamps. I understand you have quite the collection? Lady Winifred stopped pacing abruptly, a gleam of pride in her eyes. Ah, you are a woman of taste. Yes, my stamps are unparalleled, truly. Let me show you some of the rarities. I am most eager to hear what a connoisseur like yourself thinks of them. Sally swallowed her laughter and nodded gravely. I would be most intrigued, Lady Winifred. Lead the way. As they walked toward the study, Sally spared a quick thought for Tony, who was undoubtedly struggling to escape the pantry, but the momentary distraction of Lady Winifred's collection was enough to buy them time. Back in the kitchen, Tony finally managed to break free from the pantry's claustrophobic confines, and he hurried to catch up with Sally. He was red-faced and slightly disheveled, but he quickly regained his composure. That was the most humiliating experience of my life, he muttered. The second time in one day I've been trapped somewhere. The house must have it out for me. Sally was about to respond when she heard a noise from across the room. A soft, creaking sound. Something had shifted in the shadows. Quick, Tony, hide! She hissed, pulling him behind a tall cabinet. They watched in silence as a shadowy figure passed through the kitchen, moving stealthily toward the back door. The muddy footprints were still visible, and the figure's gait matched the pattern perfectly. Gotcha, Tony whispered. Chapter 5. The First Accusation. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over Foxleigh Manor. Whispers filled the air, and sharp eyes were cast in every direction. It was in this tense atmosphere that Tony and Sally, having carefully examined the clues, began to piece together the puzzle. We have enough here to start forming some serious suspicions, Tony said, his voice low as he and Sally stood in a quiet corner of the manor. His fingers drummed nervously on the back of a chair. We've seen enough behavior to know that something doesn't add up. Sally nodded, a frown on her face as she thought over their findings. The torn fabric, the strange note, the muddy footprints leading to the kitchen. Every detail pointed to someone trying to make an escape. But who? Let's start with Sir Horace, she suggested. His gambling debts are no secret. If he needed money, and the heirloom is clearly worth a small fortune, he'd have a motive. Agreed, Tony said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He's been acting strange all evening, too polished, too eager to mingle. And I can't help but notice how often his hand brushes against his coat pocket, almost like he's hiding something. Not to mention his casual attitude about everything, Sally added. Tony's eyes flicked toward the hallway. Then we should confront him. If he's guilty, he'll crack under the pressure. Sally shook her head, smiling wryly. I'm not sure it's going to be that easy, but let's see. The two of them made their way toward Sir Horace's direction. As they approached him in the drawing room, he was chatting with two other guests, laughing as if nothing were amiss. He paused when he saw them, his face breaking into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ah, my young detectives, he said, his voice smooth and warm. I hope you've been enjoying the evening despite the, shall we say, unfortunate turn of events? Sally crossed her arms, studying him closely. Oh, we've been enjoying ourselves very much. But we do have a few questions for you, Sir Horace. The gambler's eyes flickered, his smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly, however, offering a charming laugh. Questions? I dare say I don't know anything more than the rest of you. Just a bit of bad luck, eh? I'm sure it will all work itself out. Tony raised an eyebrow. You seem awfully calm for the situation, Sir Horace. I would have thought you'd be more upset. Sir Horace's lips tightened. I've been in worse situations before, my dear boy. You get used to it. Sally pressed on. I understand your situation is a bit strained financially, Sir Horace. Gambling debts, as I've heard. It wouldn't be the first time a man in debt resorted to desperate measures. For a moment, Sir Horace's expression darkened, but he quickly masked it, flashing a winning smile. Nonsense. You're all so quick to judge. Yes, I've had my difficulties, but that hardly means I'd resort to stealing. I'm not so sure, Tony replied, his voice steady. It's a tempting offer. If you were in desperate need of cash. Sir Horace's eyes narrowed, and his pleasant demeanor shifted slightly. You're treading dangerous waters, my friend, he said, his tone becoming sharper. I've been nothing but courteous to you both. Don't push your luck. Sally stepped forward. We're just trying to understand, Sir Horace. You've been under a lot of stress lately, haven't you? All those debts hanging over your head, your back against the wall, and there's the matter of that silver spoon you pocketed earlier this evening. His face flushed with rage. I've had enough of these accusations. I'll have no more of it. Sally turned to Tony, giving him a look that said they'd gotten all they were going to from him for now. Thank you for your time, Sir Horace, she said, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. As they walked away from the gambler, Tony muttered, He definitely has something to hide, but does he have the guts to steal the heirloom? I don't know. Sally paused. There's more. There's Miss Penelope, for one. Tony raised an eyebrow. What about her? Sally crossed her arms, her thoughts swirling. Her temper, for one, and the argument she had with Lady Winifred earlier today. It wasn't just a minor disagreement. She's angry, and there's no telling what someone driven by emotion could do. And remember, she stormed off right before the heirloom was revealed. True, Tony agreed, but that's not enough to accuse her outright. Just then, the two of them spotted Miss Penelope across the room, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the ground as she muttered to herself. Sally and Tony made their way over to her. Miss Fairfax, Tony greeted her. We've been wondering about your whereabouts earlier this evening. Penelope looked up, startled, then gave a sharp, curt nod. I had a rather unpleasant conversation with Lady Winifred earlier, if that's what you mean. She's an impossible woman, and I made the mistake of expressing my feelings about it. Sally studied her carefully. I imagine that conversation didn't end well. Penelope's lips curled into a tight smile. If you could call it that. I don't particularly care for her collection, and she doesn't care for my art. The feeling is mutual. Tony leaned in slightly. Where were you when the heirloom was taken? Penelope hesitated. I was in the library, and then I went for a walk in the gardens. You can ask anyone. Sally exchanged a look with Tony. Interesting. The library, you say? I don't suppose you happen to be looking at anything in particular? Penelope's gaze hardened. No, and I'm certainly not in the habit of sneaking around, if that's what you're implying. Before either of them could respond, they were interrupted by the sudden appearance of Dr. Edwin Hawthorne, the reclusive historian. He approached them slowly, his face pale, his thin lips pressed tightly together. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, he said in his usual soft, almost whispering voice. It seems, dear friends, that you've been busy. Tony nodded, not at all surprised. You've been doing more than just listening, haven't you, Dr. Hawthorne? We've seen you sneaking around the library. Dr. Hawthorne blinked, his thin hands folding together. I assure you, I wasn't sneaking. I was merely Exploring. Exploring what? Sally pressed. The heirloom? Your obsession with its history has been obvious to everyone. Dr. Hawthorne's eyes darkened. I know more about that artifact than any of you could ever imagine. It's not just a trinket, you know. It's a key to understanding the past. Tony raised an eyebrow. A key to what? Hawthorne's lips parted, but before he could answer, a muffled voice from behind startled them. Enough with the accusations! Mrs. Clara Booth, Lady Winifred's housekeeper, appeared at the doorway, her face set in a stern line. You've no right to jump to conclusions like this. Her sudden appearance caught them off guard, and she continued with a cryptic remark. Some things are best left untouched, some scores left unsettled. Her words echoed in Tony's mind as he watched her walk away, her back straight and her expression unreadable. There was something unsettling about her cryptic comment, and it definitely didn't sit well with him. As they turned to leave, Tony accidentally stepped backward onto something small and hard. The sound of a snap echoed through the room. Ow! Tony yelped, hopping on one foot. Sally turned around in disbelief. Please tell me you didn't just sit on a mousetrap. Tony grimaced, glancing down at his shoe. I'm starting to think this manor is rigged against me. Sally could barely contain her laughter. Well, at least you're not getting locked in any more pantries. Despite the absurdity of the moment, the weight of their investigation hung heavily between them. They had gathered a fair number of suspects, but the real challenge was just beginning. Chapter 6. The Truth Emerges. The morning after their intense round of interrogations at Foxleigh Manor dawned in a gloomy haze. Inside, however, Tony and Sally were far from sleepy. The previous night's events had left them both restless, and their minds buzzed with unanswered questions. They had gathered clues, witnessed suspicious behavior, and questioned more suspects than they cared to count, but they still hadn't uncovered the key piece that would point to the true thief. Sally rubbed her eyes as she leaned against the grand fireplace in the drawing room, looking every bit the weary detective. I think we've interrogated every suspect except the cook and the butler. Do you reckon they're hiding something? Tony stretched his arms and grimaced. Considering I nearly broke my neck running after Sir Horace, I'd say we've done enough chasing for today. He threw a sideways glance toward Sally. Though I think you came closer to falling into the pond than actually catching him. Sally shot him a playful glare. I'll have you know, I was almost very careful. Ignoring the lingering humor, they both returned to the matter at hand. They had narrowed down the suspects, and the evidence was beginning to point toward one person. But there was still that nagging feeling that something wasn't right. We need to dig deeper, Tony said. There has to be something we've missed. Let's start with Lady Winifred's study. We've barely touched that room, and it's the one place no one's been paying attention to. Sally raised an eyebrow. You're right. We've spent enough time chasing shadows. Maybe it's time we catch something real. The study was a lavish room, filled with ancient bookshelves and delicate antiques, all bathed in the dim light from the heavy curtains. At first glance, it appeared as though nothing had been disturbed since Lady Winifred's last visit. The air smelled faintly of old paper and dust, until they began to inspect the desk. Tony walked around the study, inspecting the walls and the various knickknacks that cluttered every surface. He paused near a large, dark wooden cabinet in the corner of the room, its intricate carvings making it seem almost too ornate to be of any real use. He ran his fingers along the edge of the cabinet and noticed something peculiar, a slight indentation in the wood, barely visible to the naked eye. Look here, Sally, Tony murmured, tugging at the edge of the cabinet. It creaked as he pulled, and suddenly a hidden compartment was revealed, an intricate drawer built into the side of the cabinet. It was cleverly concealed, almost as if someone had designed it to be overlooked entirely. Sally's eyes widened. Well, looks like Lady Winifred has a few secrets after all. They opened the drawer carefully, their hearts pounding with excitement. Inside, they found a collection of documents, old letters, bills, and receipts, all neatly arranged in a folder. But it was a particular ledger that caught their attention. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was faint, but the numbers were still legible. Tony skimmed through the pages, his eyes narrowing as he examined the figures. "This looks like a financial ledger," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "But it's full of discrepancies, missing payments, unexplained charges. It seems like someone's been siphoning money from Aunt Winifred's accounts." Sally leaned in closer. "This is exactly the kind of thing Mrs. Booth would want to keep hidden. She's been Lady Winifred's housekeeper for years, and if anyone had access to this kind of information, it would be her." Tony nodded, a frown deepening on his face. "That's the first solid piece of evidence we've found. It looks like Mrs. Booth has been skimming money off the top. No wonder she's so cryptic. She's probably been covering her tracks for years." But just as they were about to celebrate their discovery, Tony's finger traced something odd at the bottom of the ledger. There was a missing page. The tier was clean, as though it had been carefully removed, and no amount of careful searching could turn up the missing sheet. Sally's heart skipped a beat. "Wait a second. This ledger shows us someone's been mismanaging the finances, but that missing page, that could be where the real clue is." Tony rubbed his chin. "Exactly. Whoever took the heirloom probably knew that we would come across this ledger, but if they took that page, it's because it's the most important one. It might tell us exactly who the thief is." With a sense of urgency, they began rifling through the rest of the drawer. They found a small stack of notes. None of them seemed to be of much consequence, until Tony picked up one that seemed to stand out. The ink was fresh, and it appeared to be hastily written. "Meet me in the study. The deal will be made at midnight. It's time to settle the debts." Sally took the note from him and examined it closely. This is it, Tony. This note connects everything. The missing page from the ledger, the heirloom, the debts. Whoever wrote this note knew exactly what was going on in the house." Tony's heart raced as he pieced it all together. It's not about the heirloom itself. It's about the money. Whoever's been stealing from Lady Winifred needed a way to cover their tracks, and that's where the heirloom comes in. It was their last-ditch effort to get out of the hole. But just as they were about to continue their investigation, a sudden movement outside the door startled them. They both froze, listening intently. Someone was coming. Quickly, they hastily shoved the documents back into the compartment, closed the drawer, and straightened up, making sure there was no sign they had been there. Sally looked at Tony with a warning glance. "We've got to move now." Sally and Tony exchanged a look of realization. "Mrs. Booth is hiding something," Tony whispered, his voice low. "We know what we need to do next," Sally said, determination in her voice. "But this is only the beginning. We need to find that missing page, and fast." After their harrowing discovery in the study, Tony and Sally knew the time had come to confront Mrs. Booth. The housekeeper had always been a figure of authority in Foxleigh Manor, her presence as unyielding as the stone pillars that surrounded the estate. She'd been at Lady Winifred's side for years, and though she was courteous, there was always a sense of something lurking behind her calm exterior. The cryptic remark about settling old scores had only deepened Tony and Sally's suspicions. Mrs. Booth was no mere housekeeper. She had something to hide. As they walked down the long corridor to the kitchen, where they knew Mrs. Booth spent most of her time, Tony's heart pounded with anticipation. It was time to put everything together. "Do you think she's the one who removed the page from the ledger?" Sally asked, her voice low and tense. Her gaze darted down the hallway, scanning for anyone who might be lurking nearby. "It makes sense," Tony replied. "She's been in charge of Lady Winifred's affairs for years. If anyone had the chance to cover up her tracks, it would be her. And she's been so evasive, so cryptic. It all points to her." "Let's hope we're right," Sally murmured. "If we're not, things could get even trickier." They reached the kitchen door and found it ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling from within. Taking a deep breath, Tony pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. Mrs. Booth was standing at the stove, her back to them as she stirred a pot, the smell of herbs and spices wafting through the air. At the sound of their footsteps, she didn't turn around immediately, but instead continued her task with deliberate slowness. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mrs. Booth's voice broke the silence. "Well, well, the young detectives have finally arrived." She turned around slowly, her sharp eyes catching theirs, assessing them with quiet amusement. "We need to talk, Mrs. Booth," Tony said, "about the ledger, about the missing page, about the finances you've been mismanaging." The housekeeper's face remained impassive, but Tony could see the slight tightening of her jaw. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Middleton," she said coolly, placing the spoon down on the counter and wiping her hands on a towel. "I'm just here to keep the house running smoothly. I've been loyal to Lady Winifred for years." Sally stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "We know about the discrepancies in Lady Winifred's accounts, Mrs. Booth. We found the ledger. We know you've been siphoning money." Mrs. Booth's gaze flickered for a brief moment, and she clenched her fists, and for a second, the mask of composure slipped, revealing a flash of something darker underneath. The housekeeper's voice, when she spoke again, was low and almost venomous. "You've been looking through things that don't concern you," she said, her tone clipped. "You should be careful. There are things at play here that you can't possibly understand. We know there's more to this than just some financial mismanagement," Tony said. "You've been covering your tracks, but there's one thing you didn't account for: the missing page from the ledger. Why would you remove it unless it contained something far worse than money?" For the first time, Mrs. Booth's calm demeanor cracked. She stepped closer, her voice taking on an edge. "You think you're clever, don't you? Digging around in things that were never meant for your eyes." She paused, and the silence between them was thick with menace. "But you're in over your heads. You don't know who you're dealing with." Sally didn't flinch. "We're dealing with someone who's desperate enough to steal something as valuable as the Stagecoach heirloom to cover up their tracks. And we're dealing with someone who's been hiding something for a long time." Mrs. Booth's eyes darkened. "You think this is about the heirloom? You think it was all for a trinket?" The cold realization struck Tony like a blow to the chest. Mrs. Booth's motives were not about money alone. There was something more to the heirloom's disappearance, something deeper than they had suspected. "What is it about, then?" Tony asked. "If it wasn't about the money, why go to such lengths to steal the heirloom? Why remove the page from the ledger? What are you covering up?" Mrs. Booth's lips curled into a thin, almost bitter smile. She took a step back, folding her arms across her chest. "What am I covering up?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "I've been cleaning up Lady Winifred's mess for years. I've kept this house running. I've dealt with all the secrets, and now you think you can uncover everything?" Sally's pulse quickened. "We're not trying to uncover everything, just the truth. You've been hiding something, and we're going to find out what." The housekeeper's expression hardened. "You're too late," she said, her eyes flashing with sudden fury. "The truth you're looking for, well, it's not something you'll be able to handle. Not now, not after everything that's happened." Tony stepped forward. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Booth? What's been going on in this house? What's the real story?" Mrs. Booth's gaze flickered to the doorway, and for a moment she looked uncertain, as if debating whether to reveal what she knew, or perhaps if she had already said too much. Then, with a quick, almost imperceptible shake of her head, she seemed to close off completely. "You think the heirloom was the end of it?" "No, it was just the beginning." She turned away abruptly, her back now to Tony and Sally. "You should leave this alone. You'll regret it if you don't." Sally took a step forward, but Tony held out a hand to stop her. The air in the kitchen seemed to grow colder, the tension palpable. They could feel the finality in Mrs. Booth's words, but they also knew that this was only the surface. There was still so much more beneath it. "We'll find out the truth, Mrs. Booth," Tony said, his voice hard, "whether you want us to or not." For a moment, there was silence. Then, without another word, Mrs. Booth turned back to the stove, as if the conversation had never happened, her face once again the mask of a dutiful housekeeper. Tony and Sally exchanged a look, both knowing that they had just scratched the surface of a much larger, far more dangerous mystery. Chapter 7. The Culprit Unmasked. The morning after their breakthrough discovery was a blur of quick decisions and whispered plans. Tony and Sally had spent hours piecing together the clues, carefully weighing the evidence they had collected, and decided to call a meeting of all the guests where they would reveal the true culprit. Foxleigh Manor had never been more still. The guests, gathered in the grand drawing room, were all present: Sir Horace, Miss Penelope, Dr. Hawthorne, Mrs. Booth, and Lady Winifred, who had reluctantly agreed to hear the findings of Tony and Sally's investigation. The room was charged with anticipation, each person wondering what the two young detectives had uncovered. The tension was thick, as everyone seemed to wait for the other shoe to drop. Tony stood near the fireplace, his posture confident. Sally, ever the composed partner, stood by his side, her arms crossed, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. The fire crackled behind them, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. Everyone had gathered, waiting for the inevitable reveal. It was time to put an end to the mystery, to unveil the truth. "I'm sure you're all wondering why we've gathered here," Tony began, his voice steady, though there was a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "After a thorough investigation, we've pieced together the clues. We've uncovered the lies, the deception, and the motives, and we're ready to reveal the true thief." Lady Winifred, still reeling from the discovery of her heirloom's theft, leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Go on then, Mr. Middleton. I'm eager to hear who you think is responsible." The guests in the room shifted nervously, glancing at one another, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sir Horace, who had been unusually quiet for most of the evening, cleared his throat. "I've been accused already, but I trust you won't find any proof of my involvement. I have nothing to hide." Miss Penelope, still tight-lipped, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Dr. Hawthorne seemed to lean slightly forward, his pale face betraying little emotion. Mrs. Booth, standing by the door, kept her usual stoic expression. Sally stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We've gathered evidence, talked to witnesses, and examined every clue. The person responsible for the theft of Lady Winifred's Stagecoach heirloom is none other than Dr. Edwin Hawthorne." A collective gasp rippled through the room, and Dr. Hawthorne's face tightened in an almost imperceptible wince. The historian, who had been so sure of his indifference throughout the investigation, now found himself caught in the spotlight. "Dr. Hawthorne," Tony continued, his voice now rising with the satisfaction of unraveling the final mystery, "your obsession with the heirloom wasn't just a fascination with its history. It was an obsession with its value. You intended to sell it, to fund your research." The historian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is absurd," he snapped, though his words carried less conviction than usual. "I have no need for your accusations, Mr. Middleton. This is a farce." But Tony was undeterred. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Dr. Hawthorne's. "Oh, but you've left quite the trail behind you, Dr. Hawthorne. You planted red herrings to distract us from the truth. The torn fabric we found in the conservatory, it matched your coat. We found the burnt note in the fireplace, the one that seemed to be part of a purchase receipt, a receipt for the sale of the heirloom." Sally spoke up. "You thought you could hide your tracks, didn't you? But you overlooked one crucial detail. The missing page from the ledger? That was your attempt to cover up the financial transactions, the evidence of your mounting debts, and your plans to sell the heirloom." Dr. Hawthorne's face paled, his lips parting as though to protest, but no words came. The weight of the truth was upon him now, and he knew it. "Perhaps the greatest mistake you made," Tony continued, "was thinking that we wouldn't notice the small things. The fabric from your coat caught in the door, the note that didn't quite burn clean. The clues were all there, if we were just clever enough to put them together." At that moment, Mrs. Booth, who had been standing in the corner with her arms crossed, stepped forward, her voice cool and measured. "You may have found him out, but you haven't yet solved everything," she said, her gaze flicking toward Dr. Hawthorne. "But don't think that this makes up for everything. There are other secrets, Mr. Middleton." Sally glanced toward Mrs. Booth, sensing the deeper layers of the mystery still lurking. But for now, the puzzle was complete, and the culprit was caught. Lady Winifred, who had been silent throughout the entire confrontation, finally spoke. "Dr. Hawthorne, I trusted you. I welcomed you into my home, and you repay me by betraying that trust for money. How dare you?" The historian, his pride completely shattered, lowered his head in shame. I didn't want to do it, but I needed the money. My research, my work, was falling apart. I thought the heirloom was my only chance." Lady Winifred shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You were never going to find a way to fix things through deceit, Dr. Hawthorne. What you've done is unforgivable." As Dr. Hawthorne stood in silence, defeated, Tony turned to the other guests. "The heirloom has been recovered," he said, his voice strong. "It's safe, and now Lady Winifred can rest easy. We've solved the case." Sally nodded, offering a reassuring smile to Lady Winifred. "We've done what we could, Lady Winifred. The truth is out, and justice has been done." As the guests began to murmur, some in relief, others in shock, the two friends shared a brief, quiet moment of satisfaction. They had done it. The mystery was over, the thief unmasked, and the heirloom returned. Later that evening, as they made their way out of Foxleigh Manor, Tony and Sally found themselves walking side by side down the long gravel driveway, the moonlight casting their shadows long and thin. "You know," Tony said, his voice light with the familiar tone of someone who had survived yet another adventure. "For once, I'm glad we didn't end up in the pond. At least I didn't have to climb out of it this time." Sally chuckled, shaking her head. "You've had enough accidents for 1 week, Tony. The manor might fall apart if you keep running into everything." Tony grinned. "I'm beginning to think the manor is trying to trap me. First the pantry, then the pond. Next thing you know, I'll end up in the attic." Sally rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the smile tugging at her lips. "If you don't stop tripping over your own feet, I'm going to start thinking you're doing it on purpose." They both laughed, the weight of their victory settling in. The mystery had been solved and the criminal unmasked. With a chuckle and a knowing glance, they set off into the night, ready for whatever the next adventure would bring.